Hello, what's up guys? Welcome to my channel Horror Tales 1. A terribly creepy story my grandpa used to tell me about his experience in World War II. Warning, really long, but it pays off. My grandpa was a British infantryman in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he enlisted to serve his country, and while he thought that joining the military would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he was never deployed to Tunisia, or Italy, or the Pacific. Instead, he ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. This is just some historical information, but it's important to understand before reading the rest of this story. Switzerland did its best to maintain neutral status throughout the war. But regardless of its attempts to maintain neutrality, Switzerland was still highly sought after by both the Allied and the Axis powers. Once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss military. Yet, in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its military, and subsequently, the British reinforcements, to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps. That's how my grandpa found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. At this time, it was early in the winter of 1943, and my grandpa's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. Part of the advantage that they had with this location was that it was really hard to get to and therefore had little chance of being spontaneously invaded by Nazi Germany. But this was also a disadvantage because it made communication with the rest of the Swiss military very difficult. The issue with communication was further compounded when sometime in early December, a series of blizzards swept through the region and completely destroyed the few lines of communication that they had in the first place. So, essentially trapped in this isolated Swiss village, without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandpa's captain decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Weeks passed. Any roads to the outside world were buried in 7 to 9 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph/phone lines that they had were equally useless. It grew deeper into winter. The leaves were stripped from the trees, and the bare trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. The town was nestled between two large mountains. Sunlight only directly reached the town for a few hours each day, making the soldiers feel as if they were living in a state of perpetual dusk. One night my grandpa was at the town bar with a few of his friends from the company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All of the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, and none of them were used to having Brits around, so one of them began shouting in broken English, "Where take you the children?" Luckily, one of the guys my grandpa was drinking with spoke fluent German and was able to act as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of confusion and yelling, the translator turned to my grandpa and the rest of the soldiers and said, "They say some of the village children have gone missing. They want us to do something about it." Now, obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act as a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandpa and his friends told the villagers to come back to the headquarters, really just a makeshift barracks that they had thrown together in the town's church, to talk to the captain. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took about 2 hours. And basically what the captain and his self-designated translator were able to piece together was that, a few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals had noticed a variety of bizarre incidents. At first, it was just benign stuff like vanishing pieces of wood and tarp from people's sheds, but over the following 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handmade ceremonial halberd, sort of like a traditional Swiss war axe, had disappeared from above his fireplace mantel. The culmination of all of these incidents was when a village child went missing. Of course, many assumed that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as the boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predatory animal. But there wasn't only one child that disappeared. There were several. The villager who entered the bar who looked especially upset? That was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing 2 days before. He had searched everywhere for them, even rounded up a posse of his fellow townspeople to join the effort, but they couldn't find a single clue as to what had happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter, and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night looking for whoever, or whatever, was the culprit behind all the strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy, full-grown man on its own. Naturally, rumors began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were all young kids between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the original 3 kids who had gone missing, 7 children vanished from the town. Many people in my grandpa's company were growing suspicious. One explanation that got passed around was that impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers for extra cash. But even that didn't make sense because the roads into and out of the town were still blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. At this point, it was early spring and the snow was starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally when my grandpa was on patrol with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the children's and Reginald's disappearances. It was sometime past midnight when my grandpa and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandpa was at the opposite end of the street, so at first the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. My grandpa and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and it immediately tore itself away from the window and began running away. Everyone in the patrol was certain that this was what was behind the disappearances and break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming at whatever it was to stop. They kept running and running, and soon they found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep. The figure jumped into the ground. It looked like it had vanished into thin air at first, but as the patrol grew closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out and show itself, several gunshots exploded out of the entrance to the snow cave. Without thinking, my grandpa and the rest of the patrol shouldered their weapons and all began firing into the hole. Silence. They waited for what seemed like hours, but was really just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down and crawled into the cave. Several seconds later, he emerged with a completely horrified expression on his face. My grandpa took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave when he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange occurrences in the town. The figure that they had been chasing was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks before. They had shot Reginald right through the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, but also the bodies of 7 partially eaten children, either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or some sort of terrible mental issue. Reginald had gone completely insane and had begun breaking into the villagers' houses and snatching their children from their homes in the middle of the night. He had used the halberd that had been reported missing to dismember the bodies after he slit the children's throats and hid them in the cave he carved into the snowdrift. TLDR. My grandpa was stationed in the Swiss Alps during World War II, got snowed in a remote village. Kids began disappearing from the village. Turns out one of the soldiers that had gone missing from his company actually was abducting the children and cannibalizing them in a hidden snow cave that he had constructed on the outskirts of the town. Heroin is a hell of a drug. If you read this, I apologize in advance. The first time I did heroin, it was an accident. I know. What kind of bullshit junkie lie is that? But seriously, I was drunk at a party. I was a lost 18-year-old kid, and some older guys were sucking smoke off a tinfoil sheet. I thought it was some keef.
Pod residua.
Something with some THC. I didn't even know you could smoke heroin. I wanted to balance my drunk and intercepted the sheet. The second I inhaled, and I mean the absolute second, I knew I'd hit something else. My eyes slid back. Something warm rolled out of my lungs and flew through my bloodstream. Boom. I was hooked. I wasn't even upset when they told me I just hit heroin. If anything, I was angry that heroin had such a bad rep, because this was fucking incredible. Well, I figured out why heroin is so bad. It only took about 14 months, thousands of dollars, my relationship with my parents, and 3 friends overdosing to make the discovery. After one particularly brutal low where I emptied my little sister's purse in order to buy a bag, the camera zoomed out, and I saw my pathetic life for what it was. I knew I had to change before I became some street-walking zombie. I was still young enough to not just get my shit together but live a totally normal life. I looked up recovery meetings on my phone and set out to go to one the very next night. I took the bus past the cemetery where I noticed several cop cars were parked at the gates with their lights whirling. It wasn't super strange. Our city lacked green space, and people used the sprawling cemetery as a park. They jogged, walked their strollers, and even drank where a few picnic tables were set up. Sometimes there was trouble with all the people coming and going there, and by the time I got off the bus my mind was elsewhere. I followed my phone to the address and paused outside. My phone had taken me to a blonde brick building. From the looks of it, I suppose it was probably once a school. Now, in faded letters stenciled on the brick, it read, "The Center for the Road to Recovery." I opened the door and went into the hallway. It still smelled like a school, pencil shavings, and ammonia cleaner. The lights were on in one of the old classrooms and I peeked in. People were mingling outside a ring of folding chairs. One caught my eye and gave me a wide smile. "Hey, are you here for AA at 8 p.m.? "Oh, I'm actually looking for a Narcotic Anonymous meeting." The man pointed with the same hand that held a styrofoam cup. "That's down the hall, up the stairs. Room 234. To be honest, I have no idea what he said. It's what got me into this mess in the first place. I don't remember. I didn't exactly understand his directions, and being socially awkward, I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I smiled and gave a little wave. The building was big, but there couldn't be too many meetings to choose from. Every other classroom I walked by was dark. When I reached the staircase, I must have blanked and went a third floor, not the second. When I left the stairwell, I noticed the hall lights were off. I saw a closed door at the end of the hallway, and its sole window glowed yellow. I walked towards it, my sneakers screeching on the marble every few steps. I thought I heard my footfalls echo behind me, but the cadence was wrong. I spun around and swore I saw a shadow dart into a classroom. It could be a hallucination, a trick of the mind. After all, I hadn't been high in almost a day and the withdrawals would be starting any time now. Painful, sweaty hell awaited me. I picked up my pace to the door with the light, and as soon as I could see through the glass, I noticed everyone in the room was already staring at me from their folding chairs. Suddenly a face swung in front of the window to inspect me. One eye bulged and looked me up and down. The face disappeared and the door slowly opened. "Can we help you?" Hi, my name's Jack. I was told to find by Jack." I was pulled inside and patted on the back. "Oh, you scared me for a second. We don't get many visitors to the third floor. You know, your uncle told us to expect you, but that was last week. We're glad you changed your mind. It's not easy to get help. Now, don't be nervous. We love newcomers. The more of us there are, the more normal we feel." "My uncle?" I tried to correct him, but the man was too excited to see me. I couldn't get a word in. "I'm Marshall," he said, pointing at his chest. He reeked of menthol cigarettes and had yellow, jaundiced eyes and gestured a big hand towards the rest of the attendants. "Usually, we do introductions for a newcomer, but we're in the middle of something serious. I think you chose a great first meeting to attend. This one's about relapse." Marshall looked at an older man who held his head in his hands. "Here." He pulled another folding chair into the circle and I sat. I looked left and shared an awkward smile with an older, petite woman. To my right was a fat man with what looked like mud around his mouth. He was breathing heavily, and his eyes were partly closed, like he was trying to ignore some kind of pain. "Gary," Marshall groaned as he Saturday. "You mind continuing?" The older man, who had been holding onto his face, suddenly sat back straight and wiped his nose. "Well, as I was saying, I thought Greta wasn't going to be home until the next day. You know how dangerous that is. No one home, no one to judge. We get the house to ourselves, and suddenly all we can think of is getting a fix." The others around me nodded knowingly, and I did, too, to fit in. "Well, I just wanted a fix." Hi. You know how it goes. I'm getting older, and it's getting harder to find people to pick up from. But there's little in this world that can stop a fiending addict from finding a fix. And the next thing I know, I'm in my living room deep in a bag. My wife did get home on time. She wasn't even early. That's how screwed my sense of time became. She found me all messy in the morning. And he shook his head and his voice cracked as he began to cry. She left me. I was clean for 7 fucking years. One relapse and she left me. She said she couldn't live with the fear of having a husband who might always go back to his old habits. I was getting secondhand sadness for this guy. It was miserable to watch, but suddenly everything changed. I mean, it was evil. He was so young, but I'm too old to go after an older boy. I brought my head back in surprise, and the people I was seated next turned to look at me. I pretended to act natural. Something felt off about this whole meeting, and I had just realized what. There was only one woman, the rest were men, and this entire thing felt secretive, like they were hiding something that could get them in trouble. I realized I found myself in the middle of a pedophile support group. Marshall cleared his throat. Now, Gary, and this goes for you too, Jack, we only use euphemisms here. Refer to the boy like he's a drug. Don't name names. Don't say anything that makes it seem like we're anything other than a drug support group. We're pretty sequestered up here on the 3rd floor, but you never know who's listening. Gary nodded and wiped his nose. I tried my best to keep my composure. I needed to do something. I needed to report this meeting. Suddenly the door swung open and the room jolted. In the doorway stood a tall, long-haired man. His boots were muddied, and his face displayed a kind of fury. He wore a long trench coat, concealing what I imagined were weapons. Suddenly I feared for my life. I was sure he was some kind of pedo-killing vigilante, and he was about to group me in with the rest of them. He walked quickly into the circle and grabbed the fat man seated next to me by the neck. Have you told them? The vigilante growled. Have you even told the group? Or are you just fucking sitting here with your guilt? I know it was you. They have your description already. You son of a bitch. And you come here. The fat man didn't say anything. He just looked sick. Suddenly, the vigilante started to violently force his fingers into the fat man's throat. The rest of the group began to protest, and Marshall stood up and pulled the vigilante off. Ron, none of that here. I was somewhat relieved that the man was known by the group, but now I was just confused. I thought about using the commotion as an excuse to slip out, but I was too interested. Do you know what he did? The long-haired man shouted, and Marshall shook his head. A baby, Marshall. In broad daylight. A baby. I thought about the cops I saw at the cemetery earlier, and my eyes peeled back in disgust. He'd abducted a baby. What kind of monster? But I was missing something. The fat man swayed, and suddenly a torrent of brown, black vomit spewed from his mouth. My eyes were focused on something pale that sat in the pile, but I couldn't believe it.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, said the fat man in between dry heaves. It was just so fresh. I watched the bulldozer. He paused to burp, and my shocked brain finally realized what the pale thing was that sat in his pile of vomit. Bury it. I watched the bulldozer bury it. It was just so fresh, please. A guilt-free snack.
I'm sorry.
You guys are lucky. I know you guys hate it, but I'm cursed. I really don't mind the taste of embalming fluid. Oh, thank God, I thought and wiped my brow. These weren't pedophiles. They were cannibals. I stood up, bowed a little, and left the room. Everyone was too busy arguing with each other to even notice. I haven't had a hit of heroin in 87 days BTW. Pretty rad. Whenever I want a hit, I just think about the shame of relapse. Heroin ain't that great. Not at all. Getting high again still sounds good sometimes, but I just think of that fat cannibal. The shame of his relapse that shined in his eyes as he stared at the little baby leg curled in a pile of his own vomit. The monster under your bed isn't always there to scare you. I was lying alone in my room when I heard the voice, deep and crackly, coming from beneath my bed. Hey, the voice called out. I told myself I was just imagining it. Hey kid, the voice repeated. I drew my knees up to my chest and ducked my head under the blanket, trying to shut out the voice and the cold wind that drifted in through the window, ruffling the curtains. Who are you? I asked. I'm the monster underneath your bed, the voice replied. You mean you're real? I asked. What do you mean? The monster said. Of course I'm real. Do you have a name? I asked. Of course I have a name. Oh, well, what is it? Frank.
Frank?
Yeah, the monster said. Is there something wrong with that?
No.
I mean, I don't know, I said. It's just not very monster ly. Well, my parents didn't want me to be a monster. Really? What did they want you to be? A dentist. That's funny, I said. I could feel myself beginning to smile. What do your parents want you to be? It asked. I don't know. Hey, Frank. Yeah. Aren't you gonna, like, scare me or something? What? Why would I do that? Well, you're a monster, aren't you? Well, yeah, of course I am. But that doesn't mean that I scare little kids. But I thought that was your job. It is my job to scare people, he replied. But only bad people. Am I a bad person? I asked. No, he said, but you're not the one I'm here to scare. Who are you here to scare? I asked. The man inside your closet. The skin on my arms goose-fleshed up. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I fell silent as I heard a rustling coming from the closet. The door creaked open, and I could hear soft footsteps padding towards me across the bedroom floor. I didn't dare peek out of the blanket. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear heavy breathing next to me. I squeezed my eyes tight. The warm sanctuary of the blanket disappeared as it was yanked off me. I hugged my arms around my knees and prepared for the worst. A scream shattered the night air, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I opened my eyes a crack to see a knife lying on the carpet next to my bed, blade glinting in the moonlight. My parents rushed into the room and asked me what had happened, but I didn't know what to say, only that someone had been hiding in my closet and they jumped out the window. My parents called 911, and the police came right away. They picked up a man called Gary Thompson sprinting through the streets a couple blocks away. He was covered in blood and broken glass. They found Gary's car abandoned on our property, and inside they found duct tape, knives, barbiturates, and a video camera. From what I heard, Gary's lawyer employed an insanity defense, and Gary is currently incarcerated in a state mental facility for the criminally insane. I never heard from Frank the Monster again, but the officer who arrested Gary told me that he sleeps on the floor of the facility. He tells the doctors that he's terrified of Frank, the monster under his bed. I am a psychologist. My patient has Wendigo psychosis. John had been my patient for months. I couldn't label him using official DSM codes, but he appeared to have what is known as Wendigo psychosis. At the time of my initial assessment, there wasn't any direct evidence that he tasted human flesh, although I could tell it was a significant preoccupation with him, and suspected him in the creation of several recent grisly scenes. Just admiring the artwork in your office, John said to me one day. He grinned, letting me see the teeth he filed down to fine points. So much red. I wonder if we're alike, you and I. I swallowed nervously. I couldn't report his Wendigo psychosis to the authorities, though, because I would be perceived to be just as crazy as him. I couldn't even say he's a cannibal, even though he's come out and said his greatest fantasy is to devour a person over the course of 3 days. There was no proof. So much red, John repeated, like a sea of blood making its way to your kitchen table. He grinned again, seeming even more unstable. This has to stop, John. Right now, there's no direct evidence linking you to the murders, but if you keep eating people, your actions will eventually catch up to you. You haven't reported me yet. No evidence. No, I think it's because you like me. Deep down, you like me, David Morrison. Why? Why the hell would I like someone like you? I can't prove it, but I know you are a murderer. Not just that, a monster. John put a hand admiringly to his heart. You really think that about me? Yes, I do. I'd like to talk about your parents, John. My session with him ended a few minutes later, and I drove to the park, taking in the beauty of summer before heading home. My wife had gone on a business trip, so I had the place to myself. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I popped on the TV. Hannibal was on, but I stopped myself from changing the channel. For some reason, I had become intrigued by monsters. For some reason, I shook my head. The reason was clear. John. I put dinner in the oven, a chicken stuffed with carrots and onions. While that cooked, I decided to go into the basement, do some late spring cleaning. Turning on the light, I surveyed the pile of unruly boxes. A few cocoons struggled as they hung from the ceiling. Their inner cores were human, weak from neuroses or traumatic life events to the extent that they were willing to visit a lonely psychologist's house for free therapy. "You're happier this way," I said. "And you called me a monster," John replied for the cocoon of silk. I turned around, greeting John's sharp teeth and blood-red eyes. He looked like a droopy-eyed hunting dog. "Did you come to eat me, John?" John hesitated, then shook his head.
No.
"I'm here to learn from you. From the master. You've obviously found a perfect way to ensnare your victims. Teach me." So I showed John how I spun a spider's web from my own hands. I was afraid he would eat me at first, and even though he stared at me with those hungry, blood-red eyes, he left with a cocoon of silk over his left shoulder. The Wendigo told me later that he could give me the hunger, the fire in my gut which would illuminate the path of my soul. I asked who had sent him. He told me John did, because he was so very grateful for the bundle of human flesh I gave him. "A gift for a gift," the Wendigo said, disappearing into the basement gloom and leaving me alone with my thoughts. I got a job at a school everyone here is a cannibal. I recently graduated from college and was looking for a teaching job. I was getting worried because nobody wanted to hire me, but then I got a call. "Hello, Mr. White, I was calling to let you know you got the job at Northside Elementary." "Odd, I don't remember applying there." "Never mind," I said. "Thank you very much," he replied. "No problem, you'll be starting Monday." I couldn't believe I finally got a job. Monday rolled around, and when I put the address in my GPS, it sent me far out. The school was far out in the woods, odd I thought, but never mind, even if it was weird. When I went up to the front of the door, a man was sitting there with a shotgun, and the door had a lock on it. "So many red flags. Who are you?" he said. I was startled. "I'm Paul White." He looked down at his paper and looked back at me. "New guy," he said, pulled out a key and unlocked the door. "Are you a guard to keep the students safe?" He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "Sure, you can say that." And when I went in, he said, "Good luck, you'll need it," and slammed the door. Strange, I thought, but instead of thinking about it, I went straight to the principal's office. When I went in, I noticed he was wearing a mask that looked like it was from the Purge movie. "Hello, Mr. White, please sit down and please put this mask on." I followed orders and put the mask on. "Welcome to Northside Elementary. You must follow the rules and wear the mask and don't ask questions." "Got it." I was confused but replied, "Got it." "Good, your pay will be $50 an hour. You will have an agenda with what you're supposed to do, and every time the bell rings, you'll teach them their new subject." "Got it." "Yes, sure." "Good, your class is class 3. You have 4 students." I thanked him and walked out, and when at class 3 there were only 4 classrooms, and one was a cooking room, but I paid no attention. It was a small school. When I went in, the kids were also wearing those masks. "Hello, I'm Mr. White." No reply, so I sat down and looked at the agenda. First thing today was I stopped hunting. I was confused. This was elementary, but I went along and said, "Pull out your hunting stuff." The kids all pulled out bear traps. What the fuck, I thought, and the students said, "You're supposed to turn on the hunting video showing us what to do." I said, "Where?" and they pointed at the TV. I rolled it over and put the tape in that said hunting and played a demonstration video about what to do when hunting. I didn't know what kind of elementary school this was. Then after a while the bell rang, so I stopped the video and looked at the agenda. Next class, cooking. So I brought them to the cooking room, and when I opened the door it smelled like something was rotting in there. The students walked in and sat down. There were flies everywhere. I asked the students if it always smelled like this. They told me yes, and when I asked where the food was they pointed at the chest freezer. So I went over trying to open it, but it was locked. One of the students told me the key was hanging on the door. I went over and grabbed the key, and when I unlocked the freezer, an awful smell blasted me in the face. I almost threw up. But when I looked back down, I saw a young lady laying there lifeless and had parts of skin cut off. Then over the loudspeaker it said, "Mr. White, please come to the principal's office if you know what's good for you." I quickly shut the freezer door and ran to the principal's office. "Mr. White, please sit down." "Why the fuck is a body in the motherfucking freezer? What kind of school is this?" "Please sit down and I'll explain." I sat down and waited to see what he had to say. "At Northside Elementary, we teach our students about, well, cannibalism, like how to hunt, cook, and everything." I was shocked. "What the hell?" I replied. "Do the parents even know?" "Yes, they are also cannibals. We are all cannibals here. And who you found was the old teacher who used to teach your class, Ms. Elizabeth." I didn't even know what to say. Was a young teacher looking for a job, so we found her and hired her like you, but she threatened to call the police when she found out, so I raped and killed her. "No, we use her for cooking class." I didn't know what to say or do. I thought of calling the police when he said, "I advise you do as I say unless you want to be like Ms. Elizabeth. Now run along back to class, Mr. White, your students are waiting." I got up and left and walked slowly back to my students. They were sitting there quietly when I walked in. I didn't even say anything to them and went right over to the freezer and opened it back up, looking down at the body, that poor soul, so young and full of life, and was ruined by these bastards. The bell rang, so I closed the freezer, locked it, and brought the students back to our class, picked up my agenda. Next was just art. I told my class to get the art supplies and just paint whatever. I didn't even care. I didn't know what to do, because if I tried to stop them I would be murdered and probably be locked in that freezer too, but at the same time, I couldn't let them get away with this. After a while, the bell rang. My agenda said lunch was next. I told the class and they pulled out their lunch bags, and I can't even tell you how fucked up it was. They were pulling out human organs and started eating them. I wanted to puke. I couldn't take it no more. I ripped my mask off, got up and yelled and started yelling, "Screw this school." The loudspeaker came on and said, "Mr. White, put the mask back on and sit down." I just yelled, "Fuck this school, I'm out," and ran right out. I slammed on the front door. The guard opened it. I just pushed him over and ran to my car, got inside and started it, and got the hell out. I didn't even look back. I went to the police station and told them everything. The police went to the school, and when they came back, they put me in a room and asked how many bodies I found. I told them only one. They said when they got there, they found multiple dead bodies of students and 2 teachers. They said they were all wearing masks. They said the students were all shot, and then the teachers took their lives. A guard tried to fight them, but they were able to tase him and arrest him. I asked about the women in the freezer. They told me she was missing for weeks, and they had no clues or anything where she went until now. But when I asked about the principal, they said he got away, but they have police after him. The police did try to cover up the whole incident, making it look like nothing happened, and burned the school down so it wasn't in the paper or on the news. It's been about 2 weeks now. My life's been going back to normal, but last night a man was outside my house watching me, and when he realized I saw him, he ran away. I already know it's the fucked up principal. All I got to say is if he sees this, just know I'm ready and waiting for the next time he comes to my house. I'm gonna be ready. My girlfriend is a cannibal. A horrible curse befell my girlfriend, and now she can only eat human meat, and I'm her personal butcher. It all started 2 years ago when my girlfriend became very ill and struggled to eat. Anything she did eat would usually come back up a few minutes later. At first, the doctors weren't sure what was wrong with her, theorizing it may be a stomach ulcer, but after her health continued to deteriorate, further tests revealed that it wasn't stomach ulcers, but instead stomach cancer. This news shattered our world. Never in a million years could we have guessed it would be cancer. Elaine was in her mid-20s, and I know that doesn't make you immune, but it sure makes you feel that way. The cancer was caught pretty late, and neither of us had a lot of money, essentially living paycheck to paycheck, so our medical options weren't great. We live in Buffalo, meaning we were just 30 miles too far south for good and affordable medical care, and with Elaine unable to work, I made the choice to take on a second job as a nightly garbage collector. It didn't pay great, but beggars can't be choosers. It was at this job, however, that I met Eli Carson. Eli was a wild dude. He was only 30, but looked easily mid-40s. He had a shaved head with a singular rat's tail hanging out the back. His eyes were dark green, and his face had a long, thick scar going from his right eyebrow down, across the bridge of his nose, right down to his left cheek. The craziest thing about him, though, is that he grew up in a cult, a sort of offshoot of the Unification Movement cult set up by the more eccentric members. He told me he had been a member from birth and lived on a commune until he was 19, until he escaped. The stories he had from the cult made the night shift go by much quicker, but it was once I told him about Elaine's situation that the funny stories turned serious. Due to his cult links, Eli knew some pretty weird and out there people, and he put me on to someone who he said could cure Elaine 100%. Her name was Madame Arachnia. Eli described her as the craziest mix of genius and psycho I've ever met. He said that she worshipped eldritch gods and that she believed H.P. Lovecraft was not a fiction writer but instead a prophet. However, he promised me that no matter how insane her beliefs were, that nobody else was better equipped to help. I got shot one night while out on a date, and I was set to be on crutches for 6 months, but she had me walking in no time, he claimed, though I doubted the veracity of the claim. However, Elaine was quickly running out of options, and I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try everything we could. So what if it turned out to be a hoax? It wouldn't change anything about our current situation. Madame Arachnia worked out of a camp deep in a forest at Niagara Gorge. The camp was designed to look like a circus, including a big top tent. Fairy lights hung up all over the camp, connecting the multiple tents and teepees that were dispersed throughout. Up in the left corner, just beside the big top, was an animal pen that contained some sheep, goats, cows, and horses. Madame Arachnia's tent was situated at the back of the camp, guarded by two tall men dressed like jesters. However, instead of the usual colorful attire, they wore all black. They wore a skull mask and a vest made of bone, as well as a coal-black jester's hat with little skull bells that jingled as they walked. Both men carried 4 black balloons and 1 white balloon. They led me into the tent, which, unsurprisingly, was illuminated by multiple fairy lights draped across the roof. There was a strong smell of burning sage and lavender incense, and the floor was covered in hay that crunched whenever someone took a step. I had assumed that Madame Arachnia would be an old lady covered in warts, though that turned out to be very wrong. When she pulled down her shawl, she revealed a stunningly beautiful woman with a pale, freckled face, bright yellow eyes, and a tattoo of a black widow spider around her right eye. The sides of her head were shaved with the jet black hair on top done into a quiff with a white streak dyed into it. Each one of her fingers wore a golden covering coated with encrusted gems, and she had the letters H and P tattooed on the back of her left and right hands respectively. "Samuel, I'm guessing," she said while pulling off her shawl as I approached, her yellow eyes staring directly into mine as if she was trying to gawk into my soul. "That's me, though most people call me Sam," I responded while pulling out the wicker chair from under the table so that I could take a seat. "Well, Sam, I understand your dear Elaine has been attacked by a horrible disease," she replied as she picked a small satin black sack off the floor and placed it on the table, the glass contents rattling around inside as she did. "Yep, stomach cancer. We've tried everything that we could afford, but nothing's worked, and I don't know how long she has left," I explained while biting my lip. I found it hard to discuss these matters with anyone without bursting into tears. Madame sat in silence with her fingers crossed for a few seconds to allow me to regain my composure. Once I did, she continued on. "Cancer is a horrible thing. To me, it is the greatest evil in our universe. It turns our body against us and kills us slowly from the inside. A truly reprehensible disease. People beg their God to cure them, but more often than not, neither their God nor their doctor can do anything for them," she replied as she put her hand into the sack and began to rummage around inside. However, the old ones would never allow a servant to die such a horrible death. After rummaging around for a bit, she eventually pulled out a glass vial with a cardboard cork at the top. The vial was full of a crimson-red substance that swirled around in the glass. Madame Arachnia placed the vial into my hand, then with her hand she closed mine over the vial. She held my hand in between both of hers and looked me in the eye again. "I made this concoction, especially for your Elaine. She should drink this as soon as possible, then rest. It'll clear her of all ailments and strengthen her stomach in no time." I'm not sure if it was her confidence or my desire to want her to be correct, or maybe a mix of both, but at that moment I completely believed Madame Arachnia. This was going to work. "Thank you so much. What do I owe you?" I asked her as I pulled an envelope out of my jacket which contained $3,000, my entire savings. "Oh, monetary gain means little to me. Elaine's return to health will be of use to my gods. Appeasing them means much more to me than any piece of paper assigned an arbitrary value," Madame Arachnia replied as she lifted her hand up and gestured for me to put the money away. There had been many red flags from my trip to the camp, but this should have been the biggest. Nobody does anything for free, whether they take money or not. In some way, they expect to be rewarded for what they have done. However, at the time I didn't think about that. I just thought Madame was just some saint doing good acts in the name of some misplaced belief in fictional gods. How wrong I turned out to be. The first 4 days after Elaine had taken the potion were no different than usual, and I started to believe we had fallen for a stupid hoax. I was angry at myself for falling for such an obviously fake cure, and I was even angrier for having put Elaine through more stress, getting her hopes up again for nothing. On the 5th day, though, things changed for the better. Elaine woke up and seemed to be doing much better. The color had come back to her face, and she was full of energy. Her beautiful smile touched each one of her rosy red cheeks in the morning when she woke me up to tell me how amazing she felt. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw how great she looked. If it weren't for the weight loss, you wouldn't have believed that she was a cancer patient. However, the good feelings didn't last as she immediately threw up when she ate some toast that I had made for her. We were both shocked when she threw up, and I could tell how much effort Elaine was putting in to stop herself from exploding into tears. It had seemed that we found a cure, but after she threw up it became apparent It had only been a placebo, except it wasn't. We decided to go to the doctor for a checkup, hoping that the potion may have fought back some of the cancer. Not enough to return Elaine's appetite, but enough to give her back some energy and to give us a fighting chance. However, when the test results came back, the doctors were dumbfounded. The cancer was completely gone. There was no trace at all. The doctors couldn't believe their eyes. Elaine sat in silent shock upon hearing the news, only coming out of it when I threw my arms over her. "I'm alive," she said before beginning to cry as I held her tight in my arms. The doctors informed us that Elaine throwing up when eating was most likely just her body getting used to regular food again, and that it would soon return. They told us to ensure that she only ate small portions and soup for the time being, which is all she could usually stomach when she was sick. However, over the next few days, she couldn't even stomach that. For days had passed since she got the all clear, and she couldn't even eat some toast and soup. The rest of her body had been cured, but it seemed like her stomach had deteriorated. I decided I needed to meet with Madame Arachnia again. If anyone had the answers, she would. I just wish it wasn't the answer she gave. When I reached the camp, I was once again greeted by the creepy jesters who walked me into Madame's tent once more. I explained to her that the potion had worked, but that Elaine couldn't eat no matter what we tried. Her response to this took my own appetite away from me. "Well, of course, she can't eat. You aren't feeding her the right meat," she said as she placed some tarot cards face down on the table, keeping her eyes focused on them as she spoke to me. "Well, you never told me that there was food she couldn't eat. What can she eat?" I replied, expecting to get an answer like horse or rat. However, the answer was much, much worse. "Humans," she replied as she lifted her head to finally look at me and grin. My heart sank into my stomach upon hearing this, and I began to sweat profusely before lashing out in anger. "Don't joke with me," I screamed as I jumped up from my seat and lashed a closed fist against the table, causing the tarot cards to fly off the table and onto the floor. Both of the jesters took a step forward, preparing to attack me, but Madame ordered them to step back before beckoning for me to retake my seat. "Sit down and relax, Sam. I am not joking. My potions aren't a miracle they cure, but they need something in return. In this case, Elaine's stomach has been modified to fight off all infections and diseases, but in return, she can only eat her fellow humans," she explained as she reached her right hand out and called for one of the jesters, who then carried over a lunchbox and placed it on the table, opening it up to reveal a liver. "This is a human liver. Take it home and cook it for about 6 minutes on each side, then serve it. It'll be the tastiest meal Elaine has ever had, and once she has had the taste for human meat, she'll never want to go back." "Not that she has a choice," Arachnia said before starting to chuckle as she placed the top back on the box and slid it across the table to me. The anger I felt before quadrupled as I sat there being mocked. However, I took a few deep breaths and composed myself, knowing that Madame's 2 goons might not be held back by her a second time if I lost it again. "And how do I know this is a human liver? This could easily just be a liver from one of your animals. I want you to stop playing around with me and give me a proper answer. Stop this frustrating joke, please," I calmly replied as I sat back in my seat and crossed my arms. Madame didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her head to look at the jester to the left of her and nodded to him. Once she did, he walked away to the back of the tent, coming back a moment later with a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to the table and dropped the bag directly onto it. The full weight of the bag hit the tabletop with a loud thud before a head rolled out from it. A human head. Once the head rolled out, I leapt from my seat and screamed before the jester put both hands on my shoulder and forced me back down into the chair, ordering me to sit now with a hoarse voice. "We don't do jokes around here, Samuel. If I say something, I mean it," Madame Arachnia said with a serious tone, though I was no longer looking at her. My eyes were transfixed on the detached head sitting on the table in front of me. The head looked to have belonged to an older man in either his 40s or 50s, going off his wrinkled face and long gray hair with some spots of bald dispersed throughout. His facial expression was one of immense pain, and his eyes had been gouged out. I started to wonder what this man had done to earn such a fate, but that mattered little to me. What did matter, however, was how dangerous Madame Arachnia was. My right leg twitched uncontrollably underneath the table as she spoke, fearing that I may face the same fate as this man. "Now, take that lunchbox, leave this camp, and never dare return. The boys will see you out, Madame Arachnia said as the jesters approached me and lifted me out of the chair. One of them handed me the lunchbox before both walked me out of the camp and back to civilization. When I got home, I cooked the liver just as Madame had told me to, and just as she predicted. Elaine loved it, but more importantly, she was able to keep it down. I waited until the next day to see if she was able to keep it all down before sitting her down and explaining to her that she had consumed a man's liver. At first, she thought it was a joke, but once I assured her it wasn't, she understandably slapped me across the face, then stormed off, leaving me alone with a deep red hand-shaped mark on my face. She didn't return until later that night, but when she did, she was much calmer than when she left. It was that night that we accepted we only had two choices going forward. We could either do what needed to be done or allow Elaine to starve. The latter was never an option, and there was no plan B, so it was obvious that we would need to kill to keep Elaine alive. I said that I would do it as I had gotten us into this mess. We are, or I should say we were both pretty non-violent people, so just jumping straight into murdering people wasn't easy. We knew we couldn't just kill anyone. Elaine decided that we would choose certain people who deserve to die. So, that explains why I'm sitting in a parking lot across from a 24-hour gym at 1 a.m. waiting for the right person to leave. The right person was Jack Werther, a 33-year-old man and fitness aficionado. He needed to keep himself in top shape to impress the ladies, but when I say ladies, I should really say girls, young girls. Jack usually likes them between 13 and 16, and he was into some pretty weird stuff. I know this because Jack has been texting back and forth with Elaine for the last 3 weeks, though he thinks she's a 14-year-old girl. I've done this a few times now, so you might assume I was getting used to it, but if I'm being honest, I dread doing this every time. I struggle to sleep for days once I notice that meat is running low, though I thankfully don't have to do this too often. A whole human lasts pretty long, but not as long as you'd hope since it's all Elaine can eat. Most of the body can be used bar the head, hands and feet, which she struggles to eat, except the eyes, which she enjoys blended up like a smoothie. I had wished Elaine would have picked a weaker, less fitness-loving meal, but we take what we can get, and it's hard to survive multiple shots to the head from a hammer, no matter how strong and fit you are. I had to sit and wait for Jack for over 2 hours. During that time, my usual feelings of fear, anxiousness, and paranoia subsided as I tried to focus on even staying awake. However, Jack eventually left the gym and briskly walked up the quiet, empty street and into the darkness. Once I saw him leave, I grabbed the hammer out of my bag and followed after him. Time for dinner. There are things out in the snow. Last week, Mai and my wife decided to go snowshoeing in Algonquin Park. It's really fun exploring the park in the winter because you're allowed to go and camp anywhere. You aren't limited to marked trails, portages, and campsites. We also like to bring our husky because she loves the snow and rolling around in it. The three of us set out from Thompson Lake Road, which borders the far north of the park. It was a little nippy, but we had lots of layers. We made our way across Thompson Lake until we hit a small unnamed creek. We followed it through 3 small ponds and set our bearings towards Wild Goose Lake, which occupies a small valley that's opened up by Lauder Creek. We arrived on day 2. When we got there, the sun was setting. We set up camp, started making food, and went asleep when it was dark. In the middle of the particularly cold night, our dog started growling and woke us up. We just assumed she heard an animal and tried to get her to calm down, but the growling eventually turned in barking. To figure out what was freaking her out, I grabbed my flashlight and poked my head outside the tent. It was snowing, the fluffy type of snow, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I let out a yell to scare off any animals and zipped up the tent. The dog only stopped barking momentarily. I decided I'd put on all my now gear a poke around, since I wasn't tired anymore. I bundled up and climbed out of the tent. I shinned my flashlight around and just saw snow. Beyond the light of my flashlight was black. I looked around all sides of the tent and couldn't find anything until I noticed our sled was missing. I asked my wife where we left it, and she told me to the right of the tent, where I was standing, but it wasn't there. If there were any footprints around it, I trampled over them. So I decided to make small circles around the camp looking for prints as if I were tracking a deer. There was nothing. My wife decided she'd come out and help me. When she opened the flap of the tent, our dog bolted out and started hopping through the snow towards the frozen lake. I tried to catch up, but she was darting between the trees and my snowshoes were bulky. When she disappeared beyond the light of my flashlight, I lost sight of her completely. We followed her tracks through the woods and across the lake. When we reached the tree line on the other side of the lake, they stopped. Right where they ended, I saw a very small but noticeable red on the snow. We were calling out her name, but she wasn't responding. The barking had stopped completely a few minutes earlier. I didn't tell my wife about the red and instead told her we should continue in the morning. It took 10 minutes to convince her we should return to the tent, but I really didn't feel safe out there. Neither of us really slept. At 7 a.m. the sun was close to rising and the sky cleared up, so though it was still dark we could see without our flashlights. We decided we'd get up and continue looking for the dog. We left the campsite and headed to the lake. From the shore you could just barely see the other side without a flashlight. We had lights on us but didn't turn them on because our eyes were adjusted to the pre-twilight. That's when we heard it. We heard the hurt whimper of a dog, but it was unnatural. It was coming from the other side. The sound was the noise a dog would make quietly, but it was being broadcasted loud enough to be heard across the lake. This would be like hearing a human whisper at the volume of a yell. We both felt it was unnatural and decided to turn around. We decided it would be best to leave. It took twice as long to snowshoe out of there without a sled. We eventually made it back to our snowmobiles on the road and had to dig them out a bit. As we were driving out, I looked in my mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw a tall human figure at the side of the road behind us. When I turned my head back, I saw nothing but snow.